The summer sun hung high and merciless over Riverside Park, beating down on the dozens of vendor booths, inflatable bounce houses, and food stands that scattered across the sprawling green. It was mid-July, the kind of Saturday that families had been anticipating for weeks, the annual Riverside Community Fair, where the local police department set up a booth to showcase community policing initiatives. Officer had done this 100 times before. It was routine, predictable, safe, or so he thought. Stood beside Duke, his 2-year-old German Shepherd partner, near a roped-off demonstration area where children could interact with the police dog under careful supervision. Duke was perfectly trained, patient, and beloved by kids. The dog had been certified in K9 narcotics detection and was equally skilled at community relations. Had trained him from puppyhood, and their bond was unshakable. The demonstration had gone smoothly all afternoon, children petting Duke's sleek black and tan coat, asking questions about police work, and listening intently as explained how dogs help law enforcement protect communities. Wore his dress uniform despite the heat, navy blue with crisp creases, his badge gleaming under the bright sunlight. At 38 years old, he was in excellent shape, his frame lean and muscular from years of physical training. He had honest eyes, the kind that inspired trust, and a calm demeanor that put people at ease. He'd been a police officer for 14 years, most of them spent in neighboring counties before transferring to this suburban Ohio precinct just 4 months ago. He was proud of his record, clean, professional, dedicated. He had never had a complaint filed against him, never had a use of force incident, never bent the rules. The fair was crowded with the usual Saturday summer crowds. Families pushed strollers, teenagers ran between games, couples held hands as they browsed artisan crafts, and food vendors hawked corn dogs, funnel cakes, and lemonade. The smell of grilled meat mixed with sugary carnival treats hung in the humid air. A cover band played on a distant stage, their covers of popular songs creating a cheerful backdrop. Children's laughter echoed across the park, genuine, carefree, innocent. Checked his watch. It was 2:47 p.m. He'd been at the booth for 5 hours already and had another 3 to go. His feet were starting to hurt, and sweat had begun to soak through the collar of his uniform. Duke panted lightly, his tongue hanging out. Had made sure the dog had plenty of water and shade breaks throughout the afternoon. The bond between officer and K9 partner was sacred, built on absolute trust and mutual care. A woman approached with 2 children in tow, a girl about 7 years old and a boy who couldn't have been more than 3. They seemed interested in learning about Duke, asking questions in that innocent, curious way that children do. Knelt down to their level, demonstrating how to properly pet a police dog, showing them Duke's vest with its reflective lettering, explaining what words like working dog meant. The little boy's eyes were wide with wonder, the girl nodding seriously as if committing every detail to memory. Then it happened. The moment changed everything. The boy's focus shifted abruptly. His small body went rigid. His eyes, which had been fixed on Duke, suddenly locked onto his face with an intensity that was startling for a child so young. The shift in the boy's demeanor was immediate and unmistakable. The wonder vanished. In its place bloomed something darker, recognition mixed with primal fear. The child's small hand, which had been petting Duke's head moments before, suddenly pointed directly at with a trembling finger. "Bad man," the boy said. The words were clear. There was no slurring, no confusion. The child's voice was steady, but his lip was quivering. "Bad man." Time seemed to freeze. The ambient noise of the fair, the laughter, the music, the crowd, faded into a distant, muffled hum. Felt every muscle in his body tense. The woman immediately gasped, her eyes widening in horror. She lunged forward, grabbing the boy's hand and pulling him backward, her face flushing crimson with embarrassment. "I'm so sorry, I'm so terribly sorry," she stammered, her voice tight and panicked. She jerked the child away from Duke, practically dragging him through the crowd. "I don't know why he would say that. He's shy around police officers. I'm so sorry, officer." But barely heard her apology. His mind was racing. He watched the woman and children disappear into the crowd, his eyes tracking them until they were swallowed by the sea of fairgoers. His heart was hammering against his ribs. His mouth had gone dry. Duke, sensing his handler's distress pressed against his leg, his intelligent eyes looking up with concern, forced himself to smile at the next family waiting to pet Duke, but his mind was elsewhere. That boy's face, that accusation, the word bad. What had that been about? Was it some kind of strange coincidence? A traumatized child confused about something he'd seen on television or heard from an adult. But that look in the boy's eyes, it wasn't confusion or abstract fear. It was recognition. It was personal. For the rest of that afternoon went through the motions like an automaton. He demonstrated obedience commands with Duke. He answered questions from parents. He explained police procedures to curious teenagers. But his mind was spinning with questions. He'd only been in this county for 4 months. He had no history here, no incidents, no complaints. He was a model officer, so what could that child possibly know about him? By the time the fair began to wind down as the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, was exhausted, not physically but mentally. The fair shut down at 6 p.m., loaded Duke into the patrol vehicle, making sure his water bowl was filled and the dog had comfortable bedding. Duke curled up in his spot, already dozing, unbothered by the cryptic encounter that was haunting his handler. Sat in the driver's seat for a long moment before starting the engine. He stared out at the emptying parking lot, his mind turning over that moment again and again like a piece of broken glass he couldn't stop touching. That small face, that pointing finger, those 2 words that seemed to accuse him of something he couldn't comprehend. He had never felt more unsettled in his entire career. As he pulled out of the lot and drove through the suburban streets, the August evening cooling the air slightly, made a silent decision. He was going to find out who that boy was. He was going to understand why a 3-year-old child had looked at him with such certainty and fear, and said those 2 words that had awakened something deep and troubling inside him. He didn't know yet that this moment, this seemingly small, insignificant encounter at a summer fair, would unravel a mystery that had haunted his county for years. He didn't know that those 2 words would lead him down a path that would challenge everything he believed about his job, his community, and his own sense of justice. All knew was that sleep would not come easily tonight, and somewhere in the back of his mind, beneath the confusion and concern, a terrible suspicion was beginning to form, a suspicion that would prove to be the beginning of something far darker than he could ever have imagined. The drive home felt longer than usual, and for the first time in his career, Officer felt genuinely afraid of the unknown. Apartment was dark and quiet when he arrived home just after 7 p.m. It was a modest 2-bedroom place in a complex on the north side of the county, functional, clean, but hardly lived in. The walls were bare except for a few framed photographs of receiving commendations and one picture of him as a young officer at the police academy, fresh-faced and idealistic. The furniture was sparse and utilitarian, more like a hotel room than a home. Had never been one to put down roots or develop hobbies outside of work. Duke went straight to his bed in the corner of the living room, a large orthopedic dog bed that had splurged on because his partner deserved the best. The dog circled 3 times before collapsing onto it with a satisfied groan, already half asleep. Dogs were simple that way. They could let things go. They could rest without being haunted. Wasn't so fortunate. He showered off the grime and sweat from the long afternoon at the fair, standing under the hot spray of water for longer than necessary. The water beat down on his shoulders, and he tried to relax the tension that had settled into his neck and upper back. But his mind wouldn't cooperate. The moment kept replaying. The child's face, the rigid posture, the trembling finger, those 2 words that seemed to contain an accusation of something unspeakable. Bad man. After the shower, he wrapped a towel around his waist and moved to his bedroom. He dressed in comfortable clothes, gray sweatpants and a faded police academy t-shirt. It was only 8:15 p.m., but already the sun was fading into twilight. He tried to eat dinner, reheated lasagna from 2 days prior, but the food tasted like cardboard. His stomach was too knotted with anxiety to accept anything substantial. By 8:45 p.m. made his way to the small office nook that occupied a corner of his living room. This was where he did his minimal paperwork and administrative tasks. He powered up his personal laptop, a 5-year-old Dell that ran slowly but adequately, and waited impatiently for it to boot up. The fan whirred to life and the screen flickered to blue. He rubbed his face, feeling the stubble along his jaw. He hadn't shaved that morning, too focused on the fare. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. He knew what he was about to do bordered on obsessive, maybe even inappropriate. But he couldn't help himself. He needed answers. He needed to understand. Accessed his police department login credentials and entered the incident reporting system. He had legitimate access to these files as an active officer, but accessing them at home, late at night, for what amounted to a personal investigation felt like crossing a line. Still, he told himself, he was just looking for context. He was trying to understand a confusing situation. There was no harm in that. He began typing search parameters into the database. He searched for incidents involving families with young children in the past year. Then he refined it to the past 18 months. Hundreds of results came back: welfare checks, custody disputes, noise complaints, domestic incidents. Scrolled through them systematically, his eyes growing tired as the clock ticked toward 10 p.m. Nothing. No incident involving a family that matched the woman and children he'd seen at the fair. He tried a different approach. He searched for any complaints filed against officers in his precinct over the past year. Maybe someone had filed a complaint, and that's how the child had developed a negative association with police officers generally. But again, his own file was clean. No complaints, no incidents, no red flags. By 11 p.m., was growing frustrated. His laptop screen was the only source of light in his apartment now, casting his face in a pale blue glow. Duke had shifted positions on his bed, now snoring softly. The apartment was silent except for the ambient hum of the laptop's cooling fan and the occasional sound of traffic outside. Made himself a cup of coffee, strong and black, and returned to the desk. He knew he should sleep. Tomorrow he had a shift at 6 a.m., but the thought of sleep felt impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw that child's face, that accusing finger. He tried yet another search. This time he looked for missing persons reports involving children in the county area. The system pulled up dozens of cases dating back years, most of them found, reunited with families or located in other circumstances. But a few remained open. He studied the faces of missing children, their ages, their last known locations. The photos were haunting: school pictures, birthday snapshots, moments of childhood captured in pixels and data. One case caught his attention: a 7-year-old girl named Emma Mitchell, missing for 2 years. The case file indicated that she disappeared from a park just 3 neighborhoods over from where the fair had been held. Read through the details: how she'd been last seen playing near the swings while her mother was distracted momentarily, how an Amber Alert had been issued, how search parties had combed the area for weeks, how the case had eventually gone cold. The case file included photographs of Emma, a gap-toothed smile in one, serious-faced in school picture, candid shots with family members. Beneath the photos was a section about the family: 2 parents, a younger brother, Oliver, age approximately 3 years old at the time of the report. His pulse accelerated. He clicked on the file for additional details. There was a family contact number listed, an address that had been updated twice, suggesting the family had moved, possibly trying to escape the tragedy and memories. In the investigation notes, he found mention of a younger sibling present during the investigation, a toddler who'd been with the mother during interviews. Oliver. It had to be. The coincidence was too perfect, too specific. Sat back in his chair, his mind racing. So this family had lost a child 2 years ago. That kind of trauma would mark anyone. A young child in a family that experienced such devastation would likely develop anxiety around authority figures, around police, around the outside world. But that still didn't explain the certainty in that boy's voice, the recognition, the word bad. Spent the next hour diving deeper into Emma's case file. He read through witness statements, investigative notes, theories about what might have happened. The detective leading the case, Sarah, had done thorough work. The file documented every lead, every dead end, every moment of hope followed by disappointment. 2 years, and Emma Mitchell was still missing. By 2:30 a.m., was exhausted but wired simultaneously on caffeine and adrenaline. His eyes felt gritty. His shoulders ached from hunching over the laptop. Duke had awakened at some point and wandered over to the desk, resting his head on his leg in concern. Dogs knew when their handlers were stressed. Absently stroked Duke's head while staring at Emma's missing person photograph on the screen. A 7-year-old girl with bright eyes and a smile that suggested she had no idea what fate awaited her. 2 years missing. 2 years of not knowing. The family had a son, though. A son who was now approximately 5 years old. A son who somehow recognized as a bad man. A son whose reaction had triggered something deep inside his investigative instincts. He pulled up his phone and texted a message to Detective Sarah, the lead detective on Emma's case. The message was casual on the surface, asking about cold cases and whether she ever got strange, intuitive feelings about cases, but underneath, knew he was fishing for information. At 3 a.m., finally closed his laptop. He sat in the darkness for a long moment, Duke's warm weight against his leg the only anchor to reality. He knew he should sleep, but sleep felt impossible. His mind was too alive with questions, too electric with the strange certainty that something significant had happened today, something that demanded investigation. He stumbled to bed around 3:30 a.m., collapsing onto the mattress fully clothed. Duke followed and lay at his feet, ever loyal. But sleep, when it finally came around 4 a.m., was fitful and haunted by dreams of small faces, pointing fingers and words that echoed through darkness. Bad man, bad man, bad man. Woke at 5:15 a.m., 3/4 of an hour before his alarm, drenched in sweat, his heart pounding. He couldn't remember the specific content of his dreams, only the overwhelming sense of dread and the lingering echo of that child's accusation. He showered again, made strong coffee, and sat at his kitchen table waiting for detective response to his 3 a.m. text. His phone buzzed with a notification just after 5:45 a.m. The response was cryptic. "Let's talk before your shift. Meet me at diner at 6:15. Felt his stomach clench. Wouldn't be up this early, wouldn't suggest meeting before shift unless something significant had occurred to her overnight, unless his instincts had been right all along. As he prepared to leave his apartment, securing Duke in his crate with fresh water, realized with absolute certainty that whatever had happened at that summer fair, it was far from over. In fact, he suspected, it was only the beginning. The revelation was only hours away. His diner sat on the corner of Maple and Fifth, a classic American diner that had been in the same location for 43 years. Red vinyl booths lined the windows, chrome fixtures gleamed under fluorescent lights, and the air perpetually smelled of frying bacon and coffee. At 6:15 a.m. on a Sunday morning, the place was nearly empty, just the early shift staff and a few insomniacs scattered across various seats. Detective Sarah was already seated in a corner booth when arrived. She was nursing a black coffee, her dark eyes tired but alert. Was in her late 40s, a career detective with 20 years in homicide and missing persons. She had a reputation for being meticulous, intuitive, and fiercely dedicated to unsolved cases. Her file on Emma Mitchell was legendary in the department. She'd spent countless hours on the case even after it had officially gone cold, unable to let it go. slid into the seat across from her. A waitress immediately appeared with a coffee cup, which gratefully accepted. Watched him for a moment before speaking, her gaze steady and penetrating. "You saw the Mitchell family yesterday," she said. It wasn't a question. Felt a jolt of surprise. "How did you?" "Your text message at 3 a.m. about intuitive feelings on cold cases was specific enough," interrupted, leaning forward slightly. "But more than that, I got a call late last night from Mitchell. The family's been under stress lately. She said her youngest son, Oliver, had a significant emotional reaction at a community event. She didn't go into detail, but she mentioned it was an encounter with a police officer." Set down his coffee cup carefully. "When did she call you?" "Around 11 p.m. She was concerned, wanted to talk to someone in the department about Oliver's behavior. She mentioned he'd pointed at someone and said something negative. She didn't have context for it, but she knows that's not typical behavior for him." Paused, letting that sink in. "So tell me, what exactly happened?" Described the encounter in detail. The community fair, Duke, the woman with 2 children, the sudden shift in the boy's demeanor, the pointing finger, those 2 words. Listened without interrupting, her expression growing more concentrated as he spoke. When finished, sat back in her seat and exhaled slowly. "Oliver was only 18 months old when Emma disappeared," she said quietly. "He was with his mother the entire time. He would have been at home with her during the search, the interviews, all of it." She picked up her coffee cup and took a long sip, her mind visibly working through implications. A child that young wouldn't normally retain memories of events from 2 years ago. Developmental psychology suggests that most memories from infancy are lost. "But," prompted, hearing the unspoken qualifier. "But traumatic memories can be different," continued. "A child who experiences or witnesses trauma can develop implanted memories, or fragmented sensory memories of fear associated with specific triggers. Seeing a uniformed officer yesterday could have triggered a buried fear response." "You think he witnessed something?" asked, feeling the weight of the question. Leaned forward again, her voice lowering so the few other patrons couldn't hear. "I think it's possible. When Emma disappeared, we focused on the external factors, predators, abductions, accidents. But we never fully explored the possibility that something happened at home, that something was set in motion before she went missing." The waitress returned, placing 2 menus on the table and asking if they wanted to order. Waved her away distractedly. Barely noticed the interruption. "What are you saying?" asked carefully. "I'm saying," replied, choosing her words with precision, "that I've been reviewing Emma's case file every few months for 2 years. And every time I do, something nags at me. Something about the family's movements, their behavior after Emma disappeared. The way they moved twice in 2 years. The way she's been in and out of therapy. The way she seems hypervigilant about Oliver's behavior and emotional responses." She pulled a worn manila folder from her bag, the Emma Mitchell file. Opened it on the table, revealing photographs, witness statements, investigation notes. What if Oliver saw something that day? What if he witnessed the moment Emma was taken, or at least witnessed someone suspicious around the house? "But he was 18 months old," repeated. "He couldn't communicate." "Not coherently, no," agreed. "But the fear would be there, the sensory memory, the association with someone or something dangerous. 2 years later, when you appeared in that uniform with your authority and official presence, it triggered that buried response." Felt his mouth go dry. "You think the person who took Emma came to the house?" Closed the file carefully. "I think we need to talk to Mitchell. I think we need to ask her detailed questions about the days leading up to Emma's disappearance. And I think we need to find out why Oliver reacted so negatively to you specifically." They left the diner 20 minutes later. Drove, with following in his patrol vehicle. The address on file for the Mitchell family was in a quiet suburban neighborhood on the east side. Modest single-family homes with manicured lawns and well-maintained exteriors. Mitchell answered the door on the second knock, her face showing signs of the stress she'd been carrying for years. dark circles under her eyes, hair streaked with gray, a weariness in her posture that spoke of 2 years of unresolved grief. "Detective," she said, recognition flickering across her face. Then her eyes moved too, and her expression shifted, surprise mixed with something else, something like recognition. "Mrs. Mitchell, may we come in?" asked gently. The interview took place in the Mitchells' living room, a space that felt frozen in time. Photographs of both children adorned the walls and shelves, but they seemed to focus predominantly on Emma, with Oliver appearing in relatively few pictures. Oliver himself was at a neighbor's house for the morning, which worked in their favor. Sat on the edge of the sofa, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her knuckles white with tension. "Oliver's reaction yesterday at the fair was very significant," began, speaking carefully. "We think it's important to understand what might have triggered it." His eyes were wet with unshed tears. He's never done anything like that before. He's a quiet child, withdrawn since Emma went away. He doesn't speak much, and when he does, it's usually about concrete things, toys, food, familiar people. But yesterday he just reacted to officer here with such fear and certainty. "I want to go back," said, "to the days before Emma disappeared. I know we've been through this before, but I want you to think carefully. Were there any strangers around your property? Anyone unusual?" His face paled. She was quiet for a long moment. "There was someone," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "2 days before Emma went missing, a man came to the door claiming to be from the gas company. He said he needed to inspect the furnace for safety compliance. I didn't remember scheduling an inspection, so I told him no. But he lingered on the porch for a while, asking questions about how long we'd lived here, whether we had security cameras, how many children we had, and exchanged glances." "Do you remember what he looked like?" asked, pulling out a small notebook. "Middle-aged, I think, nondescript, brown hair, average height. He was dressed professionally, polo shirt with a company logo, the kind of person you'd see around and forget immediately." His hands were trembling now. "I never thought anything of it. I get those people sometimes. But after Emma disappeared, I wondered." "You wondered what?" prompted. "I wondered if he'd come back, if he'd somehow, I don't know, been involved." His voice cracked. "But I had no proof, no evidence, just a paranoid mother's guilt and fear. I blamed myself for telling him to go away. What if I'd let him inside? What if I could have prevented what happened?" Leaned forward. "Mrs. Mitchell, do you think Oliver saw this man when he came to the door?" Nodded slowly. "It's possible. Oliver would have been playing in the living room. He might have seen through the window or the door crack. He was only so little, but he was always aware of things, even then." The pieces were beginning to align in his mind. A suspicious visitor, a child who might have witnessed them, a missing 7-year-old girl, and 2 years later, a 3-year-old boy recognizing danger in the form of an authority figure. "We're going to reopen this investigation," said firmly. "And I want you to think about that man, every detail you can remember. We may need you to work with a sketch artist." As they prepared to leave, pulled aside, her eyes searched his face with desperate intensity. "Officer," she said quietly, "whatever Oliver saw in you yesterday, it means something. He doesn't react to people randomly. If you're willing to help us to help Emma, please find her. Please find out what happened to my daughter." Nodded, a weight settling onto his shoulders. "We will," he promised. "I give you my word." In the car afterward, turned to. "That's the first time has mentioned that visitor in detail since the initial investigation," she said. "She's been sitting on that memory, afraid to even speak it out loud. But Oliver's reaction yesterday gave her permission to share it. That 3-year-old boy just opened the door to solving Emma Mitchell's disappearance." Understood. Whatever was happening here, whatever darkness was hiding in the shadows of his community, it had just been illuminated by the innocent fear of a small child. And now there was no going back. The police station was quiet on Sunday morning. Most officers were out on patrol or off shift. The bullpen, The open office area where detectives worked was nearly empty except for Anne, who'd commandeered a corner desk after leaving the Mitchell house. Had brought her personal Emma Mitchell file, a bulging accordion folder that represented 2 years of obsessive investigation and countless hours of off-the-clock work. Had called in to explain that he needed to adjust his shift, citing a personal matter. His supervisor, Lieutenant, had been understanding but curious, had given him just enough information that he was assisting with a potential lead on a cold case to satisfy the question without raising alarms. Now, free from patrol duties until evening, and were about to dive into the mystery of the suspicious visitor. The description gave us is generic enough to match thousands of people, said, spreading multiple file folders across the desk. Middle-aged, brown hair, average height, professional appearance. We need more specifics. She pulled up her personal laptop, much more up-to-date than, and opened a secure database that contained records of utility companies, contractors, and service workers who'd been reported in the area over the past 5 years. The database was searchable by multiple parameters: date, neighborhood, service type, company name. The visitor claimed to be from the gas company, said, typing quickly. Let me cross-reference any service calls in the Mitchell neighborhood during the week Emma disappeared. The search produced results: legitimate gas company service calls, electric company technicians, plumbing contractors. Printed out the list and compared it against known employees of these companies. Several names appeared, but none of them matched any suspicious person's reports or prior incidents. He wasn't legitimate, said, understanding the implications. He was lying about who he was. Which means he had a reason to be in that neighborhood, replied grimly, and he specifically targeted the Mitchell house. She leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled in front of her face, her thinking pose. Here's what bothers me, she continued. Emma disappeared 2 days after this man's visit. That's not random. That's not coincidence. He was scouting. He was gathering information. He was planning. Felt cold realization settle in his stomach. You think he came back? I think he came back and took her, said flatly. And I think's intuition, the part of her that wanted to blame herself, was actually her subconscious recognizing the truth she wasn't ready to face. Over the next 2 hours, and worked systematically through the Emma Mitchell file. They reviewed the initial investigation notes, searching for any mention of suspicious persons, unusual vehicles, or anything out of the ordinary in the weeks before Emma's disappearance. They found multiple witness statements from neighbors, but nothing that seemed to point to a specific suspect. We need to expand our search, suggested. If this person was scouting neighborhoods, if he had a pattern, he wouldn't have done it just once. Nodded and pulled up a different database, missing children reports in the county area. She typed in search parameters: females, ages 5-10, missing within the past 7 years. The results were sobering. Dozens of cases appeared, though most had been resolved, found and returned home, sometimes living locally but having run away, occasionally located in other states. But some remained open, unsolved, unknown. Scrolled through the list methodically, stopping at a case from 4 years ago. Maya, she said, reading aloud, 5 years old, disappeared from Riverside Park on July 14, 2020, never found. She pulled up the case file and opened the investigation notes, leaned closer, reading over her shoulder. The narrative was achingly similar to Emma's case. A child playing in a public space, a moment of parental distraction, the child vanishing without a trace. Riverside Park, repeated. That's only 7 miles from where Emma disappeared. And it's where the community fair was held yesterday, said, meeting his gaze. Where Oliver reacted to you. A chill ran down spine. The connection was becoming clearer, more sinister. Opened the case file further, looking for investigation notes about suspicious persons. There it was, buried in a supplementary report, A witness had reported seeing a man dressed as a maintenance worker in the park several days before Maya's disappearance. The description was vague but consistent with Mitchell's description of the visitor. "We have a pattern," said quietly. "Two children, different parks, different years, but the same man, the same predatory behavior." They spent the next hour searching through additional missing children cases from the area. The database was extensive, and most cases resolved one way or another, but had a hunch, and she began filtering specifically for cases from the past 7 years where children had disappeared from public spaces or near them. She cross-referenced the dates with the dates the community fair held events. 4 cases emerged. 4 missing children, all between ages 5–10, all from the county area, all disappearing under similar circumstances. Emma Mitchell, age 7, 2022. Maya, age 5, 2020. 2 others, David, no relation to Sarah, age 8, 2018, and Sophie, age 6, 2019. "Oh my God," whispered. 4 children, Sarah said, her voice hollow. 4 disappearances, and I never connected them. I never saw the pattern because I was so focused on Emma's case, I didn't look at the broader picture. She stood abruptly and began packing, her mind visibly working through the implications. A man who moves through the community, a man who scouts locations, a man who targets children at public venues, a man who disappears after each abduction and then resurfaces to hunt again. "A serial predator," said, the words tasting like poison. "Possibly," agreed. "Or worse, an organized operation, someone who takes children and then, what? Trafficking, exploitation. All we know is that 4 children have vanished and there's a pattern connecting them." Her phone rang. She checked the caller ID and answered immediately. "Yeah, Lieutenant." A pause. "We're in the bullpen and I are reviewing some cold cases." Another pause. "No, nothing urgent, just some connections I wanted to verify." She listened for another moment. "Understood, thank you." She hung up and turned back to. "It's called a task force meeting for this afternoon. Apparently, there have been some developments in another case that might be relevant. He wants me there." "What kind of developments?" asked. "He wouldn't say over the phone," replied. "But given what we're discovering, I'm starting to wonder if there are other people in this department who've been noticing patterns without fully connecting the dots." She printed out copies of the 4 missing children's cases and organized them chronologically. As she did, his eyes were drawn to the photographs. 4 smiling faces. 4 children who should be adults now or at least teenagers. 4 lives interrupted. "There's something else we need to do," said, returning to her desk. "We need to talk to the families of the other missing children. We need to ask them the same questions we asked Mitchell. We need to know if they saw suspicious visitors in the days before their children disappeared." "That could take days," pointed out. "Then we better get started," replied. "Because if this man is still operating, if he's still active in our community, then somewhere out there could be another family about to experience exactly what the Mitchells experienced." Over the next several hours and made phone calls. They tracked down contact information for the family, the parents of David and Sophie's mother. The conversations were delicate, carefully worded to avoid raising false hope or creating unnecessary trauma, but the responses were consistent. The family remembered a man coming to their house claiming to work for the city. The parents of David recalled a contractor who'd come to assess tree work in their yard. Sophie's mother remembered someone claiming to be from the school district, surveying neighborhood properties. Different pretexts, same predator. The man had adapted his approach, varying his cover story to match each neighborhood and family profile. He was intelligent, he was careful, he was deliberate. "He's been operating for at least 7 years, said, sitting back in her chair with a look of exhaustion and grim determination. "At least 7 years, and we didn't catch it until now. Until a 3-year-old boy pointed at you and said 2 words. Understood the weight of that moment. Oliver's simple accusation bad man had cracked open a mystery that professional investigators had failed to solve. It had taken the raw, instinctive fear of a traumatized toddler to connect the dots that adults had missed. "We're going to catch this person," said. It wasn't a question or a hope. It was a statement of fact, a promise he was making to 4 missing children and their grieving families. Looked at him with something like respect in her eyes. "Yes," she agreed quietly, "we are." The afternoon task force meeting would reveal new information, new connections that would push their investigation in directions neither of them could anticipate. But for now, in this moment, they had something they hadn't possessed before, a true understanding of the monster they were hunting. And they were finally beginning to see his shape in the darkness. The conference room on the 3rd floor of the police station, filled with officers and detectives as the afternoon task force meeting began. Lieutenant stood at the head of the table, his presence commanding immediate attention. To his right stood Captain Torres, the precinct's commanding officer, a woman with sharp eyes and a reputation for not tolerating inefficiency. And entered together and took seats near the back. Carried the folder containing the 4 missing children cases, but she said nothing, waiting to see what information was being presented. "We've got a situation," began without preamble. "Over the past week, we've received 3 reports of attempted child abduction at community venues. Parents intervened in all 3 cases, and the perpetrator fled each time. No children were taken, but the descriptions are remarkably consistent." Felt his blood run cold, he and locked eyes. "The descriptions match reports we pulled from across 6 other police jurisdictions in the county area," Torres continued. "A man, middle-aged, average build, brown hair, typically dressed professionally. He approaches children at parks, fairs, school events. He uses various pretexts to engage them. When parents intervene, he leaves." "It's escalating," said grimly. "He's being more aggressive, more careless. We believe he's searching for an opportunity." Raised her hand. "Sir, I think we have relevant information about this individual." "Go ahead, detective," Torres said, gesturing for her to come forward. Distributed the 4 missing children case files to everyone in the room. As she did, could see the shift in the officers' expressions, the moment they understood the magnitude of what they were looking at. "We've connected 4 missing children cases spanning 7 years, explained, pointing to each photograph. "All from the county area, all disappearing under similar circumstances, all with reports of suspicious strangers in the days or weeks preceding their abductions. We believe these cases are connected to the recent attempted abductions." The room erupted in murmurs. Detectives leaned forward studying the files. Captain Torres' face hardened. "Why wasn't this pattern identified earlier?" she demanded. "Because we were looking at each case in isolation," admitted, her jaw tight with controlled frustration. "It wasn't until we received new information that the pattern became clear." What she didn't say, what only knew, was that the pattern had been revealed by a 3-year-old boy's instinctive recognition. "We need surveillance footage from every location where the recent attempted abductions occurred," interjected, "and historical footage from the parks where the children disappeared. If this person has been active for 7 years, there may be video evidence we haven't properly analyzed." Nodded sharply. "I'll coordinate with it to pull footage from all locations. We need to get facial recognition software working on any images we can obtain." The meeting lasted another 40 minutes, during which and provided detailed information about the pattern they discovered. By the end, a full task force had been assembled, with officers assigned to various aspects of the investigation. The energy in the room had shifted from routine police work to urgent manhunt. After the meeting dispersed and returned to the bullpen, they had access to preliminary surveillance footage from Riverside Park, the location of the community fair, and the site where Maya had disappeared 4 years earlier. The tech team had begun pulling archived footage from that date. If he scouts locations before he strikes, theorized, then he might appear on footage weeks before the actual abduction. He's planning, he's watching, he's making decisions about which children are vulnerable. Over the next 3 hours, they reviewed surveillance footage from late June through mid-July 2020, the weeks surrounding Maya's disappearance. The footage quality was grainy, typical of outdoor security cameras, but serviceable. They watched as hundreds of people moved through the park, families enjoying the summer weather, children playing, vendors setting up booths. And then they saw him. There, said, pointing at the screen, "Freeze it." Paused the footage. A man stood near the park's edge, partially obscured by trees. He wore work clothes and carried what appeared to be surveying equipment. He was watching the children's play area with an intensity that transcended casual observation. His focus was predatory. "That's him," breathed. "That's the man Mitchell described." She immediately began pulling up footage from other dates and locations: the family's neighborhood, the street near David's house, the park where Sophie had disappeared. In each location, at various points before the children disappeared, that same man appeared on camera, sometimes for just a few seconds, sometimes lingering for several minutes, always watching children, always calculating. "Run his image through facial recognition," ordered, turning to her computer. She uploaded the clearest still image from the surveillance footage into the police department's facial recognition software. The system processed the image against databases of known offenders, employment records, driver's licenses, and other photo databases. For several agonizing minutes, nothing happened. Then results began appearing on the screen. The system flagged a match. James Hogan, age 53, with a history of minor offenses, disorderly conduct, trespassing, indecent exposure. He'd moved between states frequently, always in regions where children had gone missing. His employment records showed him working for various event companies, always with temporary positions, always leaving before questions could be asked. "This is our guy," said, his voice tight with controlled rage. "This is the predator." Was already pulling additional information: Hogan's known addresses, his associates, his criminal history. What emerged was a picture of a man who'd carefully constructed a life designed to move through communities without leaving traces. No permanent address, no stable employment, no relationships that would allow someone to notice his activities. "He's a ghost," murmured. "He's designed his entire existence to be forgettable." She pulled up Hogan's DMV photograph. His image was unremarkable, exactly as Mitchell had described. Average features, neutral expression, the kind of face you'd see and forget within minutes. Perfectly designed for predation. "We need to find him," said. "He's not going to stop. The recent attempted abductions show he's escalating." "Agreed," said, already making calls to other law enforcement agencies, sharing Hogan's information, coordinating a multi-jurisdictional manhunt. Within minutes, Hogan's photograph and information were being distributed to police departments across 6 states. As evening fell, and were reviewing additional surveillance footage when Detective Martinez, a young detective in his late 20s, rushed over to their desk. "We found him," Martinez said urgently. A property manager in an industrial area called in. She said Hogan rents a warehouse space under an alias. He's been there for the past 6 months, paying in cash, keeping a low profile. But the property manager got suspicious when she noticed he had a lot of equipment being delivered, professional-grade surveillance equipment, reinforced locks, that kind of thing. And exchanged glances. Every instinct told them that whatever they would find in that warehouse would be nightmarish. "Have we obtained a warrant?" asked. "Judge approved it 30 minutes ago," Martinez confirmed. "Tactical team is assembling now. We're doing the raid at dawn, can't risk him fleeing in darkness, and we want maximum visibility and control." The warehouse address was in Patrol Precinct, an industrial area on the eastern edge of the county, a place where businesses operated without much interaction with the surrounding neighborhoods. The perfect location for someone trying to hide something terrible. As the evening wore on, more information emerged about James Hogan. He'd been operating under various aliases for at least a decade. His criminal record showed escalation over time, minor offenses in his 30s, more serious charges in his 40s, and then a 7-year gap where he'd clearly gone underground, operating without ever being caught. "He's intelligent," Captain Torres said during an evening briefing. "He learns from near misses, he adapts, he's gotten better at hiding." "Until now," replied. "Until a child's instinctive fear gave us the tool we needed to see him." Thought of Oliver Mitchell, the small boy who'd pointed with a trembling finger and spoken 2 words that would change everything. That child had done what professional investigators, advanced technology, and years of police work had failed to do. He'd identified the monster in their community. As night fell over the city, tactical teams prepared their equipment. Negotiators reviewed protocols. Detectives and officers assembled near the warehouse, maintaining a discreet perimeter. Everyone understood the stakes. Somewhere in that building there might be evidence. Worse, there might be children. Stood within the tactical operations van, watching monitors that displayed live feeds from cameras positioned around the warehouse. The building was dark, seemingly abandoned, but they knew James Hogan was inside. They knew a predator who'd operated in the shadows for over a decade was about to be dragged into the light. "Whatever we find in there," said quietly, "it won't be good." "No," agreed, "but we're finally going to stop him." They waited through the long night, the tension building second by second. Officers made final preparations. Equipment was checked and rechecked. Protocols were reviewed. And in the warehouse, unaware that the noose was tightening, James Hogan moved through his domain, completely oblivious that his reign of terror was coming to an end. By dawn, everything would change. The dawn broke gray and cold over the industrial area. It was 6:47 a.m. when the tactical team received the final go-ahead. Stood in the command vehicle with watching monitors that displayed multiple camera angles of the warehouse. Officers in tactical gear, faces obscured by helmets and masks, moved into position with practiced precision. Battering rams were. Door charges were set. "All units in position," crackled the radio. Captain Torres stood at the head of the tactical operations console, her face grave and focused. "Execute the warrant," she commanded. The warehouse entrance exploded inward. Watched on the monitors as tactical officers poured through the breached doors, their weapons ready, their movements synchronized and efficient. The building was dark inside, illuminated only by the tactical flashlights mounted on their equipment. The officers moved through the ground floor methodically, clearing rooms, calling out coordinates. "Ground floor secure. No signs of occupancy," an officer reported. Then another voice crackled through. "We have movement. 2nd floor northeast corner." His heart rate spiked. He gripped the edge of the console, his knuckles white. "Suspect is retreating toward the rear exit," another officer reported. "Pursuit in progress." There was a moment of intense radio chatter, officers calling out positions, movements, tactical updates. Then, after what felt like an eternity but was only seconds, "We have the suspect in custody, non-compliant but restrained, no weapon." James Hogan had been caught. But that wasn't what everyone was waiting for. The officers continued their systematic sweep of the warehouse, working their way toward the basement level. Descending to basement level, one officer announced, "We're seeing. There's a reinforced door, heavy locks, multiple deadbolts." "Breach it," Torres commanded. The sound of the door being forced open came through the radio, followed by a moment of silence that seemed to stretch into infinity. Then, finally, a voice so shocked it was barely comprehensible. "Oh my God! Oh my God, we have children. We have multiple children down here." His hand shot to her mouth. felt the world tilt slightly beneath him. The room erupted in barely contained energy, officers standing at attention, understanding the magnitude of what was happening. How many? Torres demanded. We're still assessing. 7 total, multiple rooms there. They're alive, they're all alive. And bolted from the command vehicle and rushed toward the warehouse. The morning air was cold and crisp as they approached the building. Emergency vehicles were already pulling up, ambulances with paramedics, child welfare specialists, victim advocates. A perimeter was being established. Inside, the warehouse was a nightmare brought to life. The ground floor was filled with surveillance equipment, camera feeds displaying various parks and community venues throughout the county area, wall maps with pin locations marking where the children had been taken, photographs, hundreds of photographs, of children. Many of the faces were recognizable from missing persons posters that had haunted communities for years. But it was the basement that revealed the true horror. The hidden room behind the reinforced door was a contained environment designed with meticulous attention to control. Soundproofing, reinforced walls, multiple locks and security mechanisms, separate compartments, each containing basic necessities, cots, water containers, minimal provisions. It was a prison designed to hold children while keeping them invisible to the outside world. And in those compartments were 7 children. Emma Mitchell was the first one saw. At 9 years old, she was skeletal, her eyes hollow with trauma, her hair matted and unkempt. But she was alive. When she saw the officers, she didn't cry or scream. She simply sat motionless, her mind apparently struggling to process the concept of rescue. Maya was in an adjacent compartment, similarly malnourished and traumatized. Then came David and Sophie, both alive against impossible odds, and 3 others, children from beyond the county area, victims whose disappearances had been reported in other jurisdictions, whose cases had never been connected to the larger pattern. "Get medical personnel in here now," commanded, her voice breaking. "Carefully. We need to move them slowly. They're going to be disoriented. They may have physical injuries we can't see immediately." Paramedics entered the basement with careful urgency. They approached the children slowly, speaking in soft voices, allowing the young victims time to process what was happening. Each child was examined and carefully lifted onto stretchers. Their eyes, confused, afraid, but also showing the first flickering signs of hope, would haunt for the rest of his life. "We need to document everything," one of the federal agents said. He'd arrived with a team from the FBI's Human Trafficking Task Force. "This is evidence. This is a federal case now." Photographs were taken. The room was documented. Evidence was carefully collected, and the photographs on Hogan's walls, hundreds of them, were collected as evidence of his systematic predatory behavior. Meanwhile, in another part of the warehouse, James Hogan sat in restraints, being read his rights. He was a pathetic figure when stripped of his ability to hunt, small, unremarkable, the face of evil wearing the mask of ordinariness. He said nothing, just stared ahead with dead eyes. But his computer equipment told a story far darker than anyone had anticipated. Federal agents were pulling data from his systems. What emerged was a sophisticated operation, not just local, but national in scope. Hogan wasn't working alone. He had connections to other predators, a network of individuals involved in child trafficking, exploitation, and trafficking across state lines. What had appeared to be an isolated serial predator was actually part of a much larger criminal enterprise. "This is bigger than we thought," one of the federal agents said grimly too, and this man was part of an organized trafficking network. "We're looking at federal charges across 6 states, potentially more." By noon, all 7 children had been transported to the hospital for medical evaluation and psychological assessment. Their parents were being, some for the first time in years, that their missing children were alive. Mitchell arrived at the hospital in a state that seemed to transcend normal human emotion. When she saw Emma, the reunion was both joyful and heartbreaking. The child was alive, but the years of captivity had marked her in ways that would take years to heal. "She kept talking about you," one of the paramedics told quietly. "Emma, I mean. She said the reason she survived was because she kept thinking about home, about her mother, about her brother Oliver." Understood then the full circle of this mystery. Oliver's fear at the community fair, the fear of a toddler who'd witnessed something traumatic, had been the key to freeing his sister from captivity. At the police station, the interrogation of James Hogan continued through the day. He said little, but his computer files spoke volumes. There were digital records of his correspondence with other members of a trafficking network, financial records showing money changing hands, evidence of children being moved between locations. Federal investigators coordinated with law enforcement agencies across the country. As the day progressed, more missing children cases were being linked to Hogan's network. The scope of the criminal operation was staggering. By evening, federal charges had been filed against Hogan. 7 counts of kidnapping, multiple counts of child endangerment, federal human trafficking violations, conspiracy charges related to organized trafficking. Additional charges were anticipated as the investigation expanded. Captain Torres held a press conference at 6 p.m. The media had descended on the police station in massive numbers, hungry for the story. The discovery of 7 rescued children, the arrest of a serial predator, the exposure of a trafficking network. It was the kind of story that would dominate news cycles for weeks. "Today, we recovered 7 children who had been missing for years," Torres announced to the assembled reporters. "We shut down a predatory operation that had victimized families across our county area and beyond. And we did this because of careful investigative work, coordination between multiple agencies, and a commitment to never giving up on missing children cases." She didn't mention Oliver Mitchell by name. The child's privacy would be protected, but knew the truth. Without that small boy's instinctive fear, without his pointed finger and those 2 words "bad man," none of this would have happened. That evening sat in his apartment with Duke beside him. The dog seemed to sense his handler's emotional exhaustion, replayed the day in his mind. The raid, the rescue, the children's confused faces, the parents' tears of joy and relief. His phone buzzed with a text from "It's only the beginning. Federal task force is already expanding the investigation. We're going to find so many more connections. Thank God for Oliver Mitchell." Agreed silently. A 3-year-old boy had done what seemed impossible. He'd identified a predator hiding in plain sight. He'd provided the key that unlocked a mystery that had haunted law enforcement for years. Justice, reflected, sometimes comes from the most unexpected places. Sometimes it arrives in the voice of a frightened child, spoken in 2 simple words that contain the power to change everything. 3 days after the warehouse raid, found himself in a federal building downtown, seated across from Special Agent David of the FBI's Human Trafficking Task Force. The conference room was sterile and cold, lined with photographs, case files, and data screens displaying interconnected networks of criminal activity. What had started as a local investigation into missing children had exploded into something far more sinister and expansive than anyone had anticipated. "What we're looking at," explained, pointing to various names and connections on a digital map, "is a sophisticated trafficking network that spans 6 states and potentially more." James Hogan wasn't the architect of this operation. He was a middle-tier operator, a procurement specialist. Felt his stomach clench. Procurement specialist. "He identified vulnerable children, targeted them, and captured them," said bluntly. "He then transferred them to other members of the network. Some were moved for exploitation. Some were trafficked across state lines. Some disappeared into the system entirely." Was present, sitting beside. Her face was pale, her jaw tight. You're saying there are more children beyond the 7 we recovered? We believe so, confirmed. Based on Hogan's computer records, communications with associates, and financial transactions, we estimate he was involved in at least 23 confirmed abductions over his 12 years of criminal activity. We've recovered 7. That means at least 16 other children were moved through the network and transferred to other locations. The implications were staggering. 16 children, some potentially still missing, others potentially victims of trafficking, exploitation, or worse. Thought of the families still waiting for answers, still hopping for their missing children to come home. We're coordinating with law enforcement agencies in 6 states, continued. Interpol is involved now. We're looking at international trafficking as a possibility. Some of these children may have been moved across borders. Over the next week, the investigation expanded exponentially. Federal agents descended on the industrial area, conducting exhaustive searches of multiple properties connected to Hogan's network. His associates were identified and arrested. Bank records were seized and analyzed. Phone records and digital communications were examined. What emerged was a horror story of systematic child predation, operating on a scale most people couldn't comprehend. 3 additional associates of Hogan were arrested in different states. They occupied different roles in the operation. Thomas Brookside, 48, operated as a middleman, receiving children from Hogan and transferring them to end users across the country. Richard, 52, ran operations involving the exploitation of trafficked children. Michael Summers, 41, was involved in international trafficking, moving children across borders. The network had survived and operated for over a decade because each member compartmentalized information. Hogan knew only Brookside. Brookside knew handlers in multiple states. No single person possessed a complete picture of the entire operation. It was designed this way intentionally, to prevent any single arrest from bringing down the entire apparatus. But James Hogan's arrest had begun to unravel the threads. Federal investigators coordinated a series of simultaneous raids across the 6-state region. Locations were identified where children had been held, where exploitation had occurred, where evidence of trafficking existed. In each location, law enforcement officers found documentation, photographs, and financial records implicating the network members. And in 2 locations, they found children. A 6-year-old boy named, ironic in its similarity to officer's name, was found in a residential property in Kentucky. An 8-year-old girl named Sophie was discovered in a safe house in Tennessee. Both children had been missing for over a year. Both bore signs of trauma consistent with exploitation. But the search continued. Federal agents estimated that at least 14 additional children remained missing, transferred deeper into the network, potentially taken to locations outside the continental United States. Attended a briefing where photographs of these missing children were displayed. Each face told a story of loss, of families torn apart, of innocence stolen. The investigators worked around the clock, following financial trails, analyzing communications, pursuing every possible lead. We found a connection to Canada, one federal agent reported. 3 of the missing children may have been transported across the border. We're coordinating with Canadian authorities. The scope of the investigation seemed to expand daily. What had begun with Oliver Mitchell's 2 words bad man had evolved into the exposure of a criminal enterprise that had victimized dozens of children across multiple states and potentially multiple countries. The media coverage was intense and relentless. News networks broadcast images of the missing children, appeals for information, analysis of the trafficking network. The public was horrified and energized. Were flooded with potential leads. Surveillance footage from multiple cities was reviewed and re-reviewed. In the second week of investigation, a breakthrough came from an unlikely source, an informant from within the network. Summers, the son of Michael Summers, came forward to federal authorities. He'd been estranged from his father for years, but had recently learned the extent of his father's criminal activities. Consumed with guilt and horror, he provided information about locations his father had used to hold children, people involved in the network, and international connections. "My father has connections to organized trafficking operations in Eastern Europe," Summers told investigators. "He wasn't just receiving children, he was sending them. There's a pipeline of trafficking that goes overseas." The information sparked international coordination. Interpol issued notices. Law enforcement agencies in multiple countries were activated. The investigation crossed from a local and national case into an international criminal investigation. James Hogan, meanwhile, sat in federal detention awaiting trial. He maintained his silence, refusing to cooperate, refusing to provide information about other network members or the location of missing children. But his silence didn't matter anymore. His computer was talking. His associates were talking. The network was unraveling. By the end of the second week, federal prosecutors had filed charges against 14 individuals across 6 states and 2 countries for their involvement in the trafficking network. The charges included human trafficking, child exploitation, kidnapping, money laundering, conspiracy, interstate trafficking of minors, international trafficking. Federal sentencing guidelines for these crimes meant decades of imprisonment, potentially life sentences for the most serious offenders. During a federal task force meeting, Captain Torres stood before the assembled officers and agents. "Because of the work done in this investigation," she announced, "we have dismantled a criminal trafficking network that was operating with impunity for over a decade. 7 children who were presumed lost have been recovered and reunited with their families. 2 additional children have been located and rescued, and a criminal enterprise that had victimized dozens of children has been exposed and prosecuted." She paused, looking directly at End. This investigation began with an intuitive observation by an officer who listened to something as simple as a child's fear. It expanded because detectives were willing to see patterns others missed. It succeeded because law enforcement agencies at all levels, local, state, and federal, committed resources and coordination. And it will continue until every missing child is found and every perpetrator is brought to justice. That evening, received a visitor at his apartment. Mitchell arrived with Oliver in tow and Emma beside her. The 7-year-old girl who'd been missing for 2 years now wore new clothes and had gained some weight, though the trauma in her eyes would take years to fade. "We wanted to thank you," said simply. "Emma doesn't remember much about her abduction. Her mind has blocked a lot of it, but she knows you helped bring her home. And Oliver wanted to see you." The 3-year-old who'd spoken 2 words that changed everything looked at with a childlike innocence that belied the trauma his small mind had experienced. Oliver reached out and took his hand. "Thank you," whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you for never giving up." Knelt down to Oliver's level. "Thank you for being brave," he said. "Thank you for telling us you saw a bad man. You helped us save your sister." Emma, standing behind her mother, offered a small smile. It was fragile and tentative, but it was there. A smile from a child who'd been stolen from the world and brought back to it. A smile that represented resilience and hope in the face of unimaginable darkness. After they left, sat with Duke on his apartment balcony, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. The investigation would continue for months, perhaps years. More charges would likely be filed. More missing children might be found. The federal task force would pursue every lead until every victim was located and every perpetrator faced justice. But the real victory, realized, had already been won. The darkness that had operated in the shadows for a decade had been exposed to the light. The predators who'd hunted children with impunity had been caught, and 7 children had been brought home to their families. It had started with a toddler's fear and ended with the destruction of a criminal network that had terrorized communities for years. Sometimes thought, justice arrives from the most unexpected places. Sometimes it comes in the voice of a frightened child, pointing at evil and calling it what it is. Sometimes one person's courage, even a 3-year-old's, can change the entire trajectory of history. 8 months after the warehouse raid, the federal courthouse was packed with media, law enforcement personnel, families of victims, and members of the public. The trial of James Hogan had consumed national attention for months. The prosecution's case had been methodical and devastating. Surveillance footage, digital evidence, testimony from recovered children, and testimony from cooperating members of the trafficking network. James Hogan's defense had been minimal. He pled guilty to all charges, refusing to put the recovered children through the trauma of testifying against him. It was, perhaps, the only decent thing he would ever do. Federal judge presided over the sentencing. Her expression was grave as she reviewed the charges: kidnapping of 7 children, multiple counts of child endangerment, federal human trafficking violations, conspiracy. The evidence demonstrated a systematic predation spanning 12 years, targeting vulnerable children at community venues and subjecting them to captivity and trafficking. James Hogan, judge addressed the defendant directly, you have pled guilty to crimes of unconscionable cruelty. You targeted children at the most innocent moments of their lives. You removed them from their families and subjected them to unspeakable horrors. The court has considered extensively the appropriate sentence for such heinous acts. She paused, her gaze fixed on Hogan. You are sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. This court hopes that you will spend every remaining day of your life contemplating the immeasurable harm you have caused to innocent children and their families. The courtroom erupted. Some people wept. Some applauded. Hogan was led away, his expression unchanged, his humanity, if he had ever possessed any, stripped away by the weight of his own depravity. Over the following months, his associates received similarly harsh sentences. Brookside and Summers all received life sentences. 11 additional network members received sentences ranging from 30 years to life imprisonment. The trafficking network that had operated with impunity for over a decade had been systematically dismantled. The investigation into missing children continued. Federal agents pursued every lead, every piece of evidence, every potential connection. By the 9-month mark, 3 additional missing children had been located and recovered, children who'd been missing for years, taken to locations in other states, their cases seemingly cold and forgotten. But 10 children remained missing. Despite the most extensive investigation law enforcement had ever conducted, despite international cooperation, despite rewards and public appeals, 10 children were not found. They represented incomplete justice, families still waiting for answers, cases that might never be fully resolved. Yet the investigation had achieved something remarkable. It had exposed a criminal network. It had saved lives. It had brought justice to a significant portion of the predatory apparatus that had been hunting children. A year after the initial discovery at the community fair, a special recognition ceremony was held at the county police headquarters. Captain Torres stood before an assembly of officers, federal agents, family members, and media representatives. Today, Torres began, we recognize the extraordinary work of the officers and agents who dedicated themselves to solving crimes that had confounded investigators for years. We recognize the courage of recovered children and their families. And we recognize that this investigation succeeded because of an act of childhood honesty, a moment when a small child saw evil and called it what it is. She gestured to Oliver Mitchell, who stood beside his mother, holding Emma's hand. The boy was now 4 years old, his trauma still visible in his careful movements and cautious demeanor. Oliver Mitchell, Torres continued, you could not have known that pointing at officer and speaking 2 words would set in motion events that would save 7 children and expose a criminal enterprise spanning 6 states. Your instinctive recognition of danger, your courage in speaking truth as your young mind understood it, fundamentally changed the trajectory of this investigation. On behalf of the police department and the community, we thank you. The applause was thunderous. Stood beside her son, tears streaming down her face. Emma, now 9 years old and beginning the long process of healing, squeezed her brother's hand. We also recognize Officer, Torres said, turning to, whose willingness to investigate a seemingly minor incident led to the breakthrough in this case, and Detective Sarah, whose commitment to cold cases and pattern recognition provided the investigative foundation that made all subsequent work possible, and stood together as the applause washed over them. Their partnership had created something that neither could have achieved alone, a conversation between a K-9 officer's intuition and a detective's systematic analysis, resulting in the exposure of evil that had been hiding in plain sight. Over the following weeks, the story expanded beyond the police department and into broader conversations about child safety, trafficking awareness, and the importance of listening to children, even when what they're trying to communicate seems small or unclear. Schools began implementing programs to teach children about body safety and trusted adults. Communities increased awareness about trafficking warning signs. Media coverage of the case sparked legislative discussions about strengthening child protection laws and increasing resources for missing children investigations. 16 months after Oliver's pivotal moment at the community fair, a documentary was released about the investigation. It was titled 2 words, The Power of a Child's Voice. The documentary featured interviews with law enforcement personnel, recovered children with identities protected, family members, and experts in child trafficking and trauma. Most notably, it featured Oliver Mitchell. The now 5-year-old boy was filmed speaking with child psychologists and investigators about what he'd experienced at the community fair, what he'd seen in the days before Emma's abduction, and how his small mind had processed and retained that traumatic memory. The documentary was powerful and heartbreaking, showing how the youngest voice in a family could be the one to unlock a mystery that had haunted investigators for years. In an interview segment, spoke directly to the camera. When I saw Oliver point at me and say those 2 words, I felt confused and defensive. I'm not a bad man, I know that, but Oliver's truth as he understood it was absolute. He knew he'd seen someone dangerous. His mind had retained that fear, and when he saw a uniform, a symbol of authority, order, law enforcement, he associated it with the person who had taken his sister. He was trying to tell us something, and instead of dismissing him as a confused child, we chose to listen. That choice changed everything. Emma Mitchell, now 10 years old, appeared in the documentary. She didn't discuss specifics of her captivity. Experts agreed that wouldn't be psychologically beneficial, but she spoke about the power of family, of love, and of the importance of never giving up hope. I'm alive because people who cared about me never stopped looking, Emma said to the camera, her young voice steady. And I was found because my little brother was brave enough to tell the truth, even though he was scared. The documentary was broadcast on a major streaming service and viewed by millions worldwide. It sparked renewed interest in missing children cases across the country. It led to the reopening of dozens of cold cases. It inspired families who had given up hope to renew their search efforts. Most importantly, it transformed Oliver Mitchell from a traumatized toddler into a symbol of childhood resilience and the power of truth-telling, no matter how small or fragile that truth might seem. 3 years after the initial warehouse raid, the final accounting was completed. 7 children recovered from the warehouse. 3 additional children located and rescued through expanded investigation. 14 traffickers prosecuted and imprisoned, many for life. Network dismantled and eliminated. International cooperation strengthened. New protocols and legislation implemented to prevent similar operations. Trauma counseling and support provided to all recovered children. 10 children remained missing. Their cases remained active. Their families remained hopeful. Oliver Mitchell, now 6 years old, began first grade. He carried no special designation in his classroom. No teacher pointed out his role in the investigation. No child understood that this quiet boy had inadvertently exposed a predatory network. He was simply Oliver, a child who'd experienced trauma but was learning to live in a world that was beginning to feel safer. Detective Sarah received a promotion to lieutenant and headed a newly created task force focused on missing children cases and trafficking investigations. Officer became a coordinator between local police and federal agencies on human trafficking issues. Both had dedicated themselves to preventing future tragedies. In quiet moments, would reflect on that summer afternoon at Riverside Park when everything changed. He would think about how a simple moment, a child's fear, a pointed finger, 2 words, had led to the exposure of evil operating on a scale most people couldn't comprehend. Sometimes, justice doesn't arrive through grand gestures or elaborate plans. Sometimes it arrives when we truly listen to what the smallest voices are trying to tell us. Sometimes it comes from a toddler who sees something his young mind recognizes as dangerous and finds the courage to speak. Oliver Mitchell had given law enforcement the greatest gift an investigator could receive, the key to a locked mystery. But more than that, he'd given families their children back. He'd given communities safety. He'd given a nation a lesson in the importance of listening, truly listening, to what children try to communicate. 2 words, a child's voice, the power to change everything. The end.